Thank you, Sunil. Mr. Ricky. Good morning to all of you here. And I can see Sunil had his revenge for yesterday by already anticipating some of my arguments in his remarks this morning. But you're right, Sunil, that I can take a little bit of credit for having brought this issue into the Indian context. In fact, I was in the States and a fairly good friend of Joseph Nye. So I asked him, do you mind if I try and apply your theories to India? And he didn't mind at all. And so about 15 years ago, I wrote a piece about India's soft power and sent it to him and said, what do you think? And he was totally supportive. And ever since, I have sort of gone on a bit of a crusade in this country, both before returning to it full time, and then subsequently after my return to India, delivering multiple lectures. And it finally had the effect that the phrase soft power entered into our lexicon. And the ultimate gratification came when the Prime Minister of India, Dr. Manmohan Singh, started using it in his speeches. So I feel I've sort of contributed to at least our self-awareness of the issue. And the reason for that was that in the preceding decade or a bit before I came up with this, there was an excessive, in my view, focus on our booming economic growth, our military strength, and so on. And people were rather rashly talking of India as a world leader or even a new superpower. In fact, the American publishers of my 2007 book, The Elephant, the Tiger, and the Cell Phone, added a gratuitous subtitle suggesting that my volume was about the emerging 21st century power, quote unquote. And I just, these are not the categories that I find appealing. First of all, the entire notion of world leadership is a curiously archaic one, reminding you of Kipling ballads and James Bondian adventures. I mean, what makes a country a world leader? If it's population, fine, we are on course to top the charts. We're going to overtake China as the world's most populous country by 2026. Military strength, we're the world's fourth largest army. Nuclear capacity, well, that was made clear, of course, with the Indo-US nuclear deal. Economic development, well, from 1991 to about 2007, we grew at an astonishingly rapid pace and became, by the end of that first decade of this century, the third largest economy in the world in PPP terms, having displaced Japan. And even in nominal terms, for example, we've overtaken the UK. So we are obviously a significant country, but in none of these are we the world leader except population. But perhaps there is one area in which we can have something to congratulate ourselves for, and that is our place in the world being defined by a combination of all of these, allied to something a little more difficult to define and explain, and that is our soft power. Because one of my many controversies in my first few years back was when I said that how can we be a superpower when we are still super poor? And that didn't do me a lot of good with our chest thumpers in this country. But the fact is that, in fact, our poverty does undermine any such claims, our relative lack of development in many areas, both with regard to the hardware of development, the infrastructure, ports, roads, railways, and the software of development, housing, sanitation, education. There are a lot of areas where we still have to make a lot of progress before we can speak in terms of superpowers, but we can certainly speak in terms of soft power in Joseph Nye's sense. And as Sunil explained, soft power is the power to alter the behavior of others. In fact, any power is the power to alter the behavior of others to get what you want. If you can make somebody do something that you want, that is your power. Hard, soft, smart, whatever other adjective you want to apply to it. Now, classically, power was exercised through carrots and sticks, right? I mean, sticks being the danda. You all know the Sam Dan Bhed philosophy. So you tell people, you do this or else, and they do it, that's hard power. Nye also includes in hard power the carrots. That is, you give them bribes, money, development aid, whatever, and they do it to make you happy so they can keep on getting your money. That's also a form of hard power, not soft. Soft power is the power of attraction. Then you can economize on the sticks and the carrots. And the argument, of course, that Nye made is based on recent global history, because if the old idea that the side with a larger army was likely to win, well, that was never strictly speaking true, because we know from our own history how smaller British-led armies with smarter maneuvering and better ammunition and technology were able to defeat our lumbering armies with their big elephants and so on and so forth. But that apart, if you look at the late 20th century, the Soviets got defeated in Afghanistan, the US got defeated in Vietnam, and these were the two big military powers of the time. And even in the 21st century, if you look at what happened to the Americans after the fall of Iraq, they won the big war, captured the capital, and then they suffered casualties pretty much every day. Why? Because as the great French statesman Talleyrand said, the one thing you cannot do with a bayonet is to sit on it. So the fact is, power has its limitations. And Nai spoke about soft power as resting on principally three attributes: our country's culture, which is attractive to others, its political values when it lives up to them, at home and abroad, and its foreign policies if they're seen as legitimate and having moral authority. Now, I go a little beyond Nai in arguing that a country's soft power emerges principally from the world's perceptions of what that country is all about. In other words, the associations conjured up in the global imagination by the mere mention of your name is often a more accurate gauge of your soft power impact than some analysis of your foreign policy. In my approach, hard power is exercised, soft power is evoked. Now, I won't go into much more detail about Nai and his application of soft power to America, the land of Boeing and Intel and Google and the iPad, Microsoft and MTV, Disney World and Hollywood, Coke, jeans, I mean, you name it, McDonald's, Starbucks, pretty much all the products the modern world uses and enjoys every day are of American origin, and that's why the admiration for America had nothing to do with the dislike, say, of its foreign policies or its military adventures. The attitude basically was, even for critics of America demonstrating outside US embassies, it was Yankee go home, but take me with you. So the fact is that this is the American thing. If you look at other countries trying to emulate it, China and the Beijing Olympics, for example, except that China doesn't have the American narrative to offer. They wowed people with that spectacular opening ceremony, but half the journalists in Beijing were writing about the lack of freedom of expression, the arrests of dissidents, and so on, which didn't do much for China's soft power. Now, as far as India is concerned, we have to understand that soft power is not something that we can necessarily shape by conscious effort. I've often argued that ultimately propaganda will always be seen by people for what it is. When we talk about soft power, it's how people perceive us, whether or not we're trying to sell a particular image of ourselves to the rest of the world. So in America, all of these products that I mentioned to you were still hugely popular, but when people started defining America's image in terms of the Iraq invasion, Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, torture, rendition, Blackwater, and its killings of Iraqi civilians, all of that, then obviously America's soft power suffered greatly, even while its hard power was at its peak. And so it's important to understand that fans of American culture don't have to agree with detaining people in Guantanamo. Using Microsoft Windows doesn't predispose you to extraordinary rendition, and so on, and therefore soft power can be undermined by hard power. Now, Nai actually spells out the kinds of things that people need, the countries need in today's world to actually enjoy soft power. And he says that soft power is enjoyed by countries, and I'm quoting here, whose dominant cultures and ideals are closer to prevailing global norms, which now emphasize, so these may not have been the norms, say, 100 years ago at the peak of colonialism, but today these norms are liberalism, pluralism, autonomy. Plus, he said, those with the most access to multiple channels of communication, and thus most influence over how issues are framed, and those whose credibility is enhanced by their domestic and international performance. Now, I won't go into too many global details. America is obviously the preeminent example, but not the only one. It's interesting to know, for example, that the French created the Alliance Française after a major military defeat in 1870, when the Prussians conquered France and marched into Paris. And when they pulled out, the humiliated French said, clearly militarism is not going to make us strong. Let us, in fact, sell our culture around the world. And the Alliance Française was created specifically to take this message across. And of course, it's had plenty of imitators, from the British Council to the Goethe Institute in Germany. And pretty much every Western country now has these institutes. And the Chinese have the Confucius Institutes. And because China has a lot of money, where a country like India may have one Nehru Center in London and is still struggling to get a center functioning to promote our culture in Washington, China has over 100 Confucius Institutes in the US alone. Now, I'll come back to how we can leverage, or whether we are leveraging our soft power, but coming back to this, I just want to stress that that's all fine, but soft power is only partly created by governments. It is partly created by governments, but it partly happens despite governments. So you can actually have a soft power that is deliberately evoked and exercised by you, but you can also have soft power or lose soft power entirely by accident. So my argument has been, and I continue to make it, that India's claim to a significant role in the world in the 21st century is not going to be coming from all the superpower talk, but from the aspects and products of our society and culture that the world finds attractive. And so our intangible standing goes up, and that in turn predisposes other countries towards being receptive to what we want done. And I have a certain civilizational view, if you like, of our soft power, because I believe the roots of our soft power run deep. The fact that our civilization over millennia offered religious and cultural freedom as well as refuge to all sorts of groups. You know, very few Indians even know today that we had the oldest Jewish diaspora in the world. When they fled the destruction of their first temple by the Babylonians. And certainly, the first one is oral legend. The second one is certainly a document when they fled the destruction of their second temple by the Romans. They took little boats and came across the Arabian Sea into Kerala, where they were completely welcomed, allowed to lead their lives, practice their faith. They never knew a single instance of anti-Semitism from any Indian in their entire stay on the Indian. And it's the only Jewish diaspora that didn't know this. Then came the Christians. St. Thomas, doubting Thomas, the apostle in the Bible, lands also on the same place. In fact, the legend is that he was welcomed on shore by a flute-playing Jewish girl. Once again, converted people died in India, as we all know, with the result that there are many, many Indians in Kerala and South India whose ancestors were Christian before any European had ever discovered Christianity. Islam, I know in the north there were some challenges that it came by the sword. That was not our experience in the south. Travelers and traders had been coming back and forth for literally 1,000 years from the Roman Empire and the Arab lands before the invention or the creation of, or the discovery, whatever the term is, of Islam. And when they brought the message of this new faith, they were welcomed, people listened to them patiently. A Kerala king was even so impressed by this message that he got on a ship and sailed off to meet the Prophet. And though he died there and never made it back to Kerala, the coconuts that he had taken with him from Kerala have been planted, and that's why to this day you can see lining the coastline of Oman near Muscat, Kerala coconut trees growing in the Arabian Peninsula to which they're not native, because this particular Kerala king, Cheruvan Perumal, went to meet the Prophet in the early 7th century AD. And indeed, he sent followers back to Kerala, and they wanted a place of worship to practice their faith. And the local Raja said, all right, well, there's a disused temple here that no one's been using. Why don't you have that as your mosque? And so the oldest mosque in the Muslim world outside the Arab Peninsula is in Kerala. It's still there, though it's gone through too many renovations since. But it was an old temple, and it's distinguished as you walk in by a gigantic Kerala brass lamp right in the middle of the oldest temple that Islam has. I mean, the oldest mosque that Islam has in India. So I mention all of this. I can give you 1,000 more examples. The Parsis coming to Gujarat and so on. I don't want to deny us the time for a meaningful discussion or interaction later. So I'll stop with the examples, but I do want to mention one thing about India that certainly made a very profound impression on me. I grew up all over the country, school in Bombay, high school, Calcutta College, Delhi. In the Calcutta neighborhood where I went to my high school, literally every morning, you would wake up hearing the wail of the muezzin calling the Muslim faithful to prayer. The sound would soon start blending with the tinkle of the bells at the mandir on the corner of the street. If you went down the street just outside the Gurudwara, they were reciting verses from the Guru Granth Sahib, and around the corner was St. Paul's Cathedral. And this was always for me India, this complete coexistence and pluralism of faiths and backgrounds. And I'm very proud today as MP for Thiruvananthapuram to represent a city where in one famous corner we have one of the great mosques, the Palayam Mosque. We have diagonally across it St. Joseph's Cathedral, and right next to it the Ganapati Temple, all in one corner in Palayam and Trivandrum. That kind of lived experience goes back centuries and is normal and natural to us. And it seems to me that that is our very, very big strength. We are, of course, in many ways a land of great diversity. I have observed in the past that we are all minorities in India, and that the whole strength of India is that there is no one way of being or doing things, at least not until now. We can talk about that separately if you want. That the great magic of India is you can be a good Indian, a good Muslim, and a good Keralite all at once. We all have these multiple identities, each of which are secure under the overall protective carapace of the collective Indian identity. And so the idea of India that I've often talked about is of one land embracing many, a land where you can overcome divisions of caste, creed, color, culture, custom, costume, conviction, consonant, cuisine, you name it. But we still have to rally around a consensus, and that consensus is on the principle that in a diverse democracy like ours, you don't really need to agree all the time, so long as you will agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. That has been the big strength of our society and our culture, and that lies at the core of the appeal of our soft power in the world. Now, the fact is that when globalization was first being talked about, read some of the articles in the first half of the 1990s in this country, as I did sitting abroad at the time, and the fear was palpable that somehow, the whole business of foreign influences would come in unchecked, that Baywatch and burgers would supplant Bharatnatyam and Bhelpuri, and of course it didn't happen. Why? Because our own culture is so strong and resilient that we can drink Coca-Cola without being Coca-Colonized. The result has been, in Mahatma Gandhi's metaphor, in fact, he really put it the best. 75 years ago, he said, I want my country to be a house with all its doors and windows open, so the winds of the world can blow through the house, provided I'm strong enough to stand on my own feet and not be blown off my feet by these winds. That's what India's experience with globalization has been, and we have in many ways absorbed foreign influences and transformed them into Indian ones. And today we ourselves are a player in globalization. The export of Bollywood to Bhangra dances on American campuses have made us a player in globalization of culture, not merely a subject of it. And our traditional practices. Yoga, one of those things that some people in my party weren't happy with me for praising the government for getting the UN to adopt the International Day of Yoga. I thought that was an excellent idea. Why not showcase some of your great practices that actually have universal appeal? There isn't a small town in America today that doesn't offer yoga classes somewhere. And that is something which actually puts out a message for India. Ayurveda, when I was in Colombia as a minister, being received by the president, one of his requests to me was, how can you get more Ayurveda practitioners to come to my country? We are very interested in alternative forms of wellness. But again, it's not just these traditional practices, it's also very much modern Indians. So the appeal of Indians as software geeks and computer gurus. Information technology has been a huge strength of ours. The IITs are now spoken of in the US, in a certain circle anyway, with the same reverence that MIT used to be spoken about. And the Indianness of an engineer or software developer is taken as synonymous with excellence. And this is a huge transformation from the days when I went to graduate school in the States in 1975, and the image was one of poor people with begging bowls, or naked fakirs lying on beds of nails, or snake charmers doing the rope trick, or at best, you know, caparisoned elephants and maharajas sitting atop them, none of which corresponded to the reality of India in which we all live today. But now it's become the opposite extreme, so that a history graduate like myself can be accosted at a European airport by an anxiously perspiring white guy saying, you're Indian, can you help me fix my laptop? Now every Indian is assumed to be a tech wizard or a computer geek. And so this skill we have, whether it's as engineers, whether it's as IT experts, whether it's as doctors. And I remember the whole episode of the American television show ER. Probably most of you now have forgotten it, but at the turn of the century, the turn of the millennium, about 15 years ago, the #1 hit show in America was a show called Emergency Room, or ER. And when the pilot episode came out first, it actually got negative reviews by critics saying, how unrealistic, who's ever seen an emergency room in America without an Indian doctor? So they actually had to write a key part for an Indian doctor. And then when the episodes featuring her, this is Parminder Nagra, Bended Like Beckham fame, started coming out, the show became a huge hit and was #1 for 4 or 5 years in America. So that is now immersed in the American consciousness that you know, an Indian doctor is everywhere. But it's not just that. Look at India's business innovation. Look at the fact that Indian companies are now acquiring foreign companies in the developed world, so that a meme went around the internet a couple of years ago when the then newly re-elected but now former British Prime Minister David Cameron went off to reclaim his mandate from Buckingham Palace. And all these Indians on Facebook and so on started sending out pictures saying, look at the British Prime Minister going to see his Queen in an Indian car, because he was in a Jaguar owned by the Tatas, escorted by police in another Indian car, a Land Rover. I mean, if that isn't enough to give you a post-colonial frisson, I love telling the story in the wake of my new book, An Era of Darkness, of how Jamshedji Tata, when he tried to set up a modern steel plant in India in the face of British opposition and indeed outright hostility from the British government. It took him 20 years to get all the permissions. At that point, a British official, an imperial, in fact, the chairman of the railway board at that time, sneered that he would personally eat every ounce of steel that an Indian was capable of producing. I always say I wish he'd lived long enough to see the day when the descendants of the same Jamshedji Tata bought up the remnants of British steel when he acquired Chorus. Might have given him a bad case of indigestion. Now, or for that matter, I mean, while we are praising good old Jamshedji Tata, you know, he got thrown out of Pike's Hotel, or Watson's Hotel, there's some dispute which hotel it was, Watson's Hotel perhaps in Bombay, because there was a sign outside saying Indians and dogs not allowed. So what did he do? He went off and built a bigger, more opulent, more luxurious hotel, which Indians were allowed to come into. I don't know about the dogs. But the Indians were admitted. It was called the Taj Mahal Hotel. Today, it's one of the great hotels of the world, whereas Watson's Hotel, from which he was thrown out, has long since closed. So that kind of confidence, if you like, puts India forward in the kinds of things it's been able to do in the 21st century as well. As Joseph Nye pointed out, in the information age, it's not enough to be the bigger army or the larger economy. It's the country with the land of the better story that prevails. We have to be the land of the better story. We must retain our ability to tell stories about ourselves, and I don't just mean talking about anecdotes. I mean that the lived experience of India must involve stories that are so positive and exciting that they're more persuasive and attractive to foreigners, to the rest of the world, than those of our rivals. Some years ago, before she entered politics, I love to tell the great Smriti Irani story. You know that when the Afghanistan crisis was at its peak and American soldiers were basically there after 9/11 and then the conquest and the defeat of Taliban and so on. You know what was our biggest asset in Afghanistan? We didn't have any soldiers in the international presence. What we had was Kyonki Saas Bhi Kabhi Bahu Thi. It was the single most popular television show on Afghan television. By about 2005, it was commanding a 92% audience share. It was such compulsive viewing in this Islamic society where family problems are literally hidden behind the veil. Suddenly a TV show gave Afghans an opportunity to discuss love and sex and marriage and relationships and mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law and all these things. And there were anecdotes. I read a British newspaper, I mean the Reuters agency, so not an Indian journalist, did a big story about the profound impact of the show on Afghan society, where weddings would be interrupted so that people could actually go and watch the show for half an hour, 8:30 in the evening, and then return to the ceremony. Mullahs started complaining that religious observances were being affected. In one episode in Mazar-e-Sharif, at 8:30 precisely, all the robbers knew that the chowkidars would be busy watching TV. One enterprising robber stole every single detachable part from a luxury car. The windshield wipers, the side view mirrors, the hubcaps, the spokes, etc. And then he scrawled in chalk on the windshield, Tulsi Zindabad. So this, to my mind, and the Indian taxpayer is not paying for this, right? This is India's great strength, was until the mullahs finally succeeded in banning the show. And of course, Smriti Irani made the unwise decision of leaving the career she was so good at for another one. But anyway, so my point is, it's all about what we are, how we come across, not necessarily what we legally project. Even if ICCR, the Indian Council on Cultural Relations, likes to show that India is a cultural superpower and so on, it's all of these things. It's Mahatma Gandhi's amazing image in the world. When IBM or Apple can use his image in their ads, you suddenly realize what your soft power lies in. And Nehruji, before the term had even been invented by Joseph Nye, was a skilled exponent of soft power. Because we were a relatively weak and poor society when the British left us on our knees in 1947, but he developed for India a role in the world based entirely on our soft power, our civilizational history, our moral standing, the values of our culture and so on, and made India the voice of the oppressed and the marginalized against the big power hegemons of the day. But, and this is where the buts have to come in before I wrap up, and that is that the great flaw in Nehruji's approach was that his soft power was unrelated to any acquisition of hard power. And so the humiliation of the military defeat by China in 1962 showed the crippling limitations of a purely soft power approach in international affairs. You know, a century earlier, 60 years before the China War, Theodore Roosevelt had said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." We spoke loudly and we had no stick at all. So the fact is the rhetoric of peace can only take you so far. Soft power becomes credible when you have hard power behind it. That's what made the US so successful. Our soft power appeals because we are a growing, booming, thriving economy. So both have to go together. Now, if you look at our use of hard power, our history is very mixed with very few good examples. Obviously, the 1971 war with Pakistan, the huge triumph in Kargil, the swift paratroop intervention in the Maldives to reverse a coup. Those are things that India has done that have exercised hard power. But against these are such a long list of failures of the 62 war, the disaster of the IPKF in Sri Lanka in '87, the humiliation of the hijack of the Indian Airlines aircraft to Kandahar in 1999, with the ineptitude of our handling of the initial hijack, our failure to blow out the tires in Amritsar, then our own foreign minister going cap in hand with 4 released terrorists to hand them over to the Pakistani killers, who then, of course, as we know, continue to use these people to wreak havoc on us and others. One of the people released was a fellow who killed the American journalist Daniel Pearl later. So we don't have a strategic doctrine based on hard power, sorry to say, and our record isn't brilliant, But that does also undermine the credibility of our soft power. It explains, on the one hand, why we like relying on soft power, because that's what we're good at, and we're not so good on hard power. But I'm not sure it's enough. You see, if you look at China or Russia, it's the opposite story, right? They have tremendous hard power and rather weak soft power. But definitely, the Bolshoi ballet or kung fu movies are doing more for the image of Russia or China in the world than the People's Liberation Army or Siberian oil reserves. But we go the other way. That is, it's not that we have great hard power and our soft power is the soft edge of it. We have great soft power and our hard power doesn't come across as credible enough. So we then find a situation where an Islamist terrorist will enjoy a Bollywood movie one evening and put off a bomb in the same movie theater the next day. We've seen this happen. And again, you know, this is not surprising. The perpetrators of 9/11 in the US ate their last dinner at a McDonald's. So hard power without soft power stirs up resentments and enmities, but soft power without hard power is a confession of weakness. So we really have to understand that we need to consistently have a better story to tell, but buttress it with some credibility at home. Now, the Chinese in Tibet, the Russians in Ukraine, are all examples of a major military power winning the hard power battle and losing the soft power war. So where soft power works is in attracting enough goodwill from ordinary people around the world to reduce the sources of support and succor that our enemies enjoy, including the terrorists, and without which they cannot function. But it doesn't actually change those who want to attack us. I mean, frankly, practicing yoga doesn't mean agreeing with the speeches of Yogi Adityanath. And that's something we ought to realize in this country. And that does mean we need to deal effectively with our internal problems before we can seriously speak of leveraging any leadership role in the world. We must ensure that we do enough to keep our people healthy, well-fed, and secure, not just from jihadi terrorism, but from the daily terror of poverty, hunger, and ill health. Now, progress is being made. We know that we have a green revolution, a white revolution in dairy, a blue revolution in fisheries, but not all the benefits of those have reached everybody in our society. And when we celebrate 6 or 9% growth, whichever it's going to turn out to be, we mustn't forget the bottom 25% of our society, because without them, our soft power will always ring hollow, whether here or abroad. Now, similarly, our democracy is part of our soft power. If we want to be attractive to others, we can't afford to be a tyranny. We must preserve the precious pluralism that is such a huge civilizational asset in today's world, in the world of the information era. Our democracy, our thriving free media, our contentious civil society forums and NGOs, our energetic human rights groups, the repeated spectacle of our remarkable general elections, all of these have made India an extraordinary example to the world of the successful management of diversity. There isn't any other example to compare with ours. So it adds to India's soft power when our non-governmental organizations actively defend human rights against the government, promote environmentalism, fight injustice. It's a vital asset that the Indian press is, despite all its irresponsibility, that it's free, lively, irreverent, and disdainful of sacred cows. This ethos of democracy and great civilization, not just tolerance, as Swami Vivekananda said, but acceptance of diversity, all of this has been an immeasurable asset to our country. Now, it's essential that India does not allow the specter of religious intolerance and political opportunism to undermine the soft power, which is its greatest asset in the world of the 21st century. If you want true leadership in this globalizing world, that's the kind of thing you can't afford to do. And I can tell you that, that the strategic advantages that have accrued, for example, in the Arab world, the African countries, from our Bollywood cinema, from our political things and so on, we have perhaps not done enough to systematically harness them. The Chinese are better at leveraging their soft power, except their soft power is undermined by their own blatant record of intolerance, of dissent, their lack of democracy, their exercising too much muscle in their own backyards. All of that undermines their attempts to leverage their soft power through the Olympics, through the Confucius centers and so on that I talked about. We actually have the soft power, but we're not able to leverage it enough. Not because of too much hard power, which, as I said earlier, is not our problem. We still have to develop, in many ways, our hard power, but because somehow we are not fully realizing that the world's respect requires us to accentuate domestically those aspects of our society, our civilization, our democracy, that outside countries also find attractive. And so if you want to do well in the world's reckoning, be the kind of society that is the one about which the most positive stories are told, then it won't matter whether you win too many wars or not. Sympathy will always be with you. Admiration will be for you. The better story is not merely the story that can be told, it is the story that is heard and repeated, whether or not you are trying to tell it. So, many of you will remember the horrors of what happened with Nirbhaya and the terrible, terrible impact it had on our image. We had so many cancellations of tourist applications from women coming to this country. The image of India was so negative as a land of rape and assaults on women, even though statistically they're much lower than most European countries. Still, there was this notorious incident when an Indian PhD student was disinvited from his scholarship by a German woman professor saying, "I cannot accept a student from a culture that doesn't respect women." Now, can you imagine the damage this has done to India's soft power? Obviously, the kind of statements made by some idiots defending the rapists and assaulters and saying, why was she out late at night and this kind of stuff, did us far more damage than we in India, used to this kind of troglodyte discourse, realize. But if you want to have your image in the world recognized, you have to internally change into the kind of society that is admired around the world. My fight for expanding our freedoms, for example, through decriminalizing homosexuality in Section 377, is because these people who are objecting to me and shouting me down in Parliament don't even realize how much this harms our image around the world. That we are perhaps the only democracy which still persecutes people for being whom they can't help what they are. It's really horrible. What the criminal action is not the poor people trying to show love for each other, it is those of us who would outlaw it by peering into their bedrooms. And to my mind, that is something that undermines our soft power as well. So, to conclude, India will thrive in the 21st century, will succeed in the world only as a land that is open to the contention of ideas and interests within it, that's unafraid of the prowess or the products of the outside world, that is wedded to the democratic pluralism that is India's greatest strength, and that is determined to liberate and fulfill the creative energies and freedoms of its people. Such an India will tell the kinds of stories the rest of the world wants to hear and is glad to repeat. And that will offer us our great triumphs in the media of the information age, and then perhaps we can talk in very different terms about what kind of world leader we might really want to be. Thank you very much. Jai Hind.